everyone. I welcome you on behalf of Public Policy and Opinion Cell IIT Kanpur in this policy workshop on decoding China. So, this workshop is organized with the collaboration of C3S or Chennai Center for China Studies. The C3S is a non-profit public policy think tank organization which carries out in-depth studies on Sino-Indian border issues, India-China relations on geopolitical, economic, and on trade issues. This organization also creates a forum for discussion and a strong database for research on China and addresses the interest of business community in India, especially while dealing with China. It also organizes some discussions, lectures, seminars, and brings out publication in these topics. Today is the first day of the policy workshop on decoding China. This workshop is designed for those students who are interested to specialize on a subject related to China or just about want to learn about the country in a general. The participants would be able to analyze the China's growth or rise as an eminent global world power and its implications for India and the world. They will also get a strong foundation on the subjects like international relations and strategic studies. The theme of today's workshop is China's foreign policy and objectives, China and the world, with Mr. Tanvir Jaikishan. Mr. Tanvir Jaikishan is a consultant with over 5 years of experience working in healthcare and life science consulting. He currently works as Chief Operations Officer in Red Kangaroo Healthcare Private Limited in Mauritius. Tanvir holds a master's degree in international health policy from London School of Economics. His passions are study of geopolitics and the classical antiquities. He is a regular contributor to and a member of Chennai Center for China Studies. He is also member of the International Institute of Strategy Studies in London. I will now request all of you to welcome Mr. Tanvir Jaikishan to take the podium and start it off. Welcome, sir. The podium is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Arka. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tanvir Jaikishan. It's nice to be speaking with you today. As Arka mentioned, I live in Mauritius, live and work in Mauritius. I've been here for the last 4 years, and we are currently in the middle of a 50-day lockdown, and this is day 24. I'm delighted to be able to speak to you about Chinese foreign policy. It is a very large topic to speak about, and I don't believe an hour is going to do it justice. You could fill an entire library with books and material on Chinese foreign policy, and it still wouldn't be enough. But we will endeavor to sort of cover the broad areas and, more importantly, understand what the implications are for India. Now, when we think of foreign policy, what we need to understand is that countries do not develop foreign policy in a silo. Foreign policy is usually interlinked and dependent on a country's political objectives, its economic objectives, and its national security objectives. And all of this forms what is called grand strategy, right? So where does a country see itself? How does it see itself bettering its trade? How does it see itself bettering its economy? How does it see itself gaining allies against potential adversaries? How does it see itself trading with adversaries? How does it see itself in bilateral and multilateral institutions? So there's a lot of interlink and overlap between foreign policy, domestic policy, economic policy, and national security. So it's very important to, when we talk about Chinese foreign policy, it's very important to also understand what Chinese domestic, political, economic, and national security policy is along the way. So that's why I feel it's imperative that we start at the beginning, from the rise of what we now know is, or from the beginning of what we now know as modern China or the People's Republic of China. All right. Also, at the same time, when we think of foreign policy, typically in a democracy, foreign policy is not the preserve of one person or one leader. Foreign policy is usually decided on with by ministries, by committees, by subcommittees, by foreign secretaries, foreign ministers, bureaucrats, analysts, and all sorts of what are government officials who come together in several different working groups to advise the prime minister on foreign policy or advise the president on foreign policy. For countries, for democratic countries like the United States and Europe, Congress plays a huge role in influencing foreign policy, right? For example, if President Obama wants to trade with or open relations with Cuba or sign a nuclear deal with Iran, he needs to get Congress's approval ultimately. Even monarchies still have a very, what do you say, consensus driven foreign policy approach with a lot of advisors advising kings on foreign policy issues and so on and so forth. But and this is where China, I believe, is fundamentally different because of since its founding 72 years ago, 50 of those years, the foreign policy of China has been determined by three men, right? The first was Mao Zedong, who's the father and the founder of modern China. The second was his successor, Deng Xiaoping. And now it's Xi Jinping. So it's very important that we go back to the beginning and understand China's foreign policy and its evolution from the Mao Zedong era all the way to Xi Jinping of today. Now, as I'm sure you're all aware, China became a country, or the People's Republic of China, in 1949. And it was a fight between the nationalists, which is Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists led by Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong prevailed, and the country with the world's largest population became a communist country. Now, at that time, the US and was virulently anti-communist, and we were beginning to see the origins of the Cold War, with the Soviet Union on one side and the US and Europe on the other side. So when China became a communist nation, it was immediately an international pariah. The recognition or the diplomatic recognition was given to the Taiwan, right? And the only friend or the only real ally that China had at that time was the Soviet Union, because they were both communist countries. And China relied very heavily on the Soviet Union in the early days for technology, to help build up the military, to help supply arms and ammunition, to help build capacity, to help with industrialization, and to even help eventually with nuclear weapons. So there was a great bonhomie between the Soviet Union, between Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong in those days. And what do you say? We would see this sort of grand alliance between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, posing a threat to the America and sort of Western-led capitalist order. Now, again, bear in mind that Deng Xiaoping was the founder of modern China. He was an authoritarian, and he made foreign policy. There was nobody else who could advise him on foreign policy. There was nobody else who could sort of have a word in. Whatever he decided what would happen, and it happened as per his will. In fact, when war broke out, the Korean War broke out, and America intervened on the side of South Korea, a lot of Mao Zedong's advisors came and told him, look, don't pick on America, don't pick a fight with America. They've just defeated Hitler, they've just defeated the Nazis. Why would you want to go to war with them? They're the most powerful nation on the earth. And he said, well, I don't care. They need to be taught a lesson. And so China intervened on behalf of North Korea. And for 3 years, the war was fought and ended in a stalemate. And this sort of, what do you say, continued throughout the decades. Now, interestingly, around that time in the 1950s, especially 1953, Joseph Stalin of Russia passed away and was succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev. Now, Khrushchev wanted to take a more sort of softer conciliatory line with the West, and he wanted to undo Stalin's damages and his purges. It was at this time when there was a schism between Mao Zedong and Nikita Khrushchev, between China and Russia. And primarily, this was because both of these leaders disagreed on how to deal with the West. And more importantly, both of these leaders had very different ideals of communism, right? I mean, the Soviet model of communism was industrial workers, what do you say, demanding their rights. But Mao's China was about agrarian revolution or agricultural revolution. So Mao's teachings was about agrarian or agricultural revolution, whereas the Soviet communist model went of the Karl Marx model, which was workers uniting to fight for their rights. So eventually, what would and you would think that with the Soviet Union being China's only ally, you would think that the Soviet Union being an important country for China, the China relying very heavily on the Soviet Union because it was still not an industrialized nation, it was still not the global superpower that it is today, that it would sort of tread carefully and try and keep the relationship. But uh, Mao Zedong was someone who believed very firmly in his model of agrarian revolution and agrarian communism. And he believed that China was an excellent template to export this model of agrarian communism to countries that were just coming out of colonial rule, which was North Korea, which was Vietnam, which was Cambodia. And a lot of these countries found a lot of resonance in this agrarian form of revolution and agrarian based communism. And ultimately, it led to a split between these two countries, between China and the Soviet Union. And this is important because even then, when China was deeply economically interdependent on the Soviet Union, was not the powerhouse that it was today, it was a very assertive country. It was a country that said, look, we don't have to agree because we are communists. We can be enemies, we can be antagonists. So even then, there was a lot of pride and assertiveness in the way that China conducted its foreign policy, but it was essentially a global pariah. And in fact, what's more outlandish is that both of these countries went to war. China and the Soviet Union went to war, for which China got itself a bloody nose. And it was because of this, something else happened. In 1971, Henry Kissinger, which was the Secretary of State to Richard Nixon, right? He visited China because Nixon wanted to open relations with the Chinese government. And in 1972, Nixon made his first visit of a US president to the People's Republic of China, met Mao Zedong, and it was this meeting that would frame the basis for diplomatic recognition of China by the United States 7 years later in 1979. Now, again, Mao was a leader who believed in communist agrarian revolution. He believed fundamentally that any model of growth and development had to be based in sort of agrarian reform. And this is what led to the two greatest disasters of his time, which is one was the Great Leap Forward, which is what he did was he took farmers, essentially, divided them into communes and said, now you're going to start making steel. And many of these farmers did not know. Well, no farmer knew how to make steel. The steel that they produced came from low quality furnaces. They were horrible steel, useless steel. He tried to industrialize using farmers. And then this is an oversimplification of the Great Leap Forward. And because they were trying to make steel, they were not growing crops. And when they were not growing crops, there was a famine and people died. Some say about close to 30 million, some say even more. And then after that, towards the end of his life, he again launched what was called the Cultural Revolution, where he said, look, we need to now purge intellectuals. We need to purge the bourgeois. We need to purge the traditionalists who are trying to bring in ancient Chinese characteristics. And we need to purge them from our society. And these purges led to, I would say, anywhere between deaths in the hundreds of thousands to about 20 million, depending on which source you believe. Obviously, the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution set China back in terms of its growth, in terms of its development, in terms of, and the human toll was simply catastrophic. Now, at the time, a very entrepreneurial, member of the Communist Party, a visionary rather, Deng Xiaoping had been purged as part of the Cultural Revolution and had been restored. Now, he was restored to his position as the chairman of the Central Military Commission. And he decided, look, I'm going to be the power behind the throne. So when Mao Zedong died, he appointed another, a successor, Hua Guofeng. And Deng Xiaoping said, look, I'm going to outmaneuver the general secretary of the party, and I'm going to be the power of the throne. I'm not going to sit on the throne myself, but I am going to be the power behind the throne. And that's exactly what he did. He outmaneuvered the various factions and the various political sort of cliques within the party and became the power behind the throne. And he understood then, he said, look, we are a backward country. We need to build our economy. We need to open up to the world. And more importantly, we need to be a friend to the US, because any country that opposes the US is poor. and any country that sides with the US is rich. And that was a simple logic. So he proposed what was called the Four Modernizations. He said, look, we need to improve agriculture, industry, defense, and science and technology. And our foreign policy is going to be crafted towards getting as much help as possible from the West, from wherever we could, to try and improve on these areas. And so he believed in sort of quieter diplomacy. It was he that the famous attributed axiom was, bide your time, hide your strength. Bide your time, hide your strength. Despite prioritizing defense as an area of improvement, what he did was he cut the People's Liberation Army by 1 million soldiers. And what he said was, look, he went to the army chiefs and said, I don't have the money right now to keep a large army. I'm going to give you enough soldiers to defend the homeland. I'm going to give you enough soldiers to defend the territorial integrity of China. But now is not the time for military development. Now is not the time for military modernization. We need to focus on the economy. We need to focus on industrialization. We need to focus on agriculture, and more. We need to come out of Mao Zedong's sort of form of agrarian revolution. We need to come out of this mindset of always preparing for war, because Mao was always at war. He was at war with the Americans. He was at war with the Indians. He was at war with the Russians. He was always preparing for war. So Deng understood that as a country, they could not afford to go to war again and again. So the foreign policy that he sort of calibrated was of how do we open up to the world? How do we slowly open up our markets to the world to be able to learn from the best? And again, like his predecessor, he was extremely authoritarian. All decisions were made by him. The general secretary of the party at that time was Hua Yaobing. And what he would do, despite only being the commission, the chairman of the Central Military Commission, he had all the power. He would actually force Hua Yaobing to read pre-prepared speeches. And every time Hua Yaobing tried to, come outside his aukat, as we say, he would have him brought back into line. To which point Hua Yaobing actually said, I put myself on a scale to weigh myself, which was a Chinese way of saying, I tried to come out of my aukat. So he was very much the power behind the throne. He was the power, and he was an authoritarian in the way he made decisions. In fact, analysts who were preparing policy documents for him would typically produce two documents with opposing views. For example, should China improve its relations with the Soviet Union? The analysts would produce two documents, one yes and one no. They would then go to Deng Xiaoping and try and gauge which side he was leaning. So if he was leaning yes, they would say, well, what a coincidence. Here is a report that affirms what you were thinking of. So this was a man who believed in sort of opening up to the world and learning from the best. But he was not someone who was looking towards sort of political liberalization. He was a firm believer of the Communist Party. He was a firm believer of the one-party system. And this is when we come to the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989. Now, in 1987, Zhao Ziyang was elected the general secretary of the party. And Zhao Ziyang was a reformer. He believed in genuine political reform. He believed in genuine sort of liberalization of the Chinese political system. He wanted more inclusive participation, and he wanted the people to have a voice. So in 1989, when there were student demonstrations in Tiananmen Square, Zhao Ziyang actually walked to these student demonstrators and made that very famous speech saying, look, we are old, we don't matter. Your voice is important. Your voice counts. I am fully behind you. I support you. Well, that didn't make Deng too happy. And he ordered in the tanks and the military to come in and crush the student revolution. And that led to a huge number of deaths. And that was the Tiananmen Square massacre. Now, obviously, that led to a huge backlash, international condemnation, forcing Deng to sort of quietly resign and move away from the limelight. Zhao Ziyang, who was the general secretary of the party, was purged and placed under house arrest for openly defying Deng Xiaoping and sort of openly supporting students, supporting democracy. And eventually Zhao Ziyang was sort of replaced by Jiang Zemin, right? Now, again, Jiang Zemin had a tough job. He was following two big men, Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. And his job was more of a steward. His job was to continue and build on the work of Deng Xiaoping, which was opening up the Chinese economy. And to that, his foreign policy was sort of it was very calibrated. He increased the number of overseas visits that Chinese leadership made. He reached out sort of more towards the West. You must understand, by the 90s, the Cold War had come to an end. And around that time is when he fundamentally decided, okay, we are now rebuilding our economy. We have now opened up to the world, but we need to start building up our military. We need to start now building a robust national security. We need to start rebuilding our army, our navy and air force, and we need to start modernizing them. So in the 90s, while India was actually moving away from military modernization, because the 90s as a decade was a lot of political upheaval for India, governments were rising and falling. Around this time, the Chinese were actively focusing on building their military, which is why they have a good 15, 20-year head start over India in terms of military modernization and military planning in general, right? Now, as we move into 2000, I would say the most important aspect of Chinese foreign policy was joining the World Trade Organization, right? Because China was obviously trading with a lot of countries and it was a preferential trade partner, but joining the World Trade Organization meant getting better deals with existing partners and getting access to new markets. Now, the US at the time, the Bill Clinton administration was supportive of China joining the WTO. The Chinese government lobbied very hard to join the WTO, and they basically launched what was fundamentally a charm offensive. And what the US told them was, look, you have to reduce tariffs, you have to protect companies' intellectual property rights, and if you're able to do that, if you're able to lower the barriers to your markets, we will bring you onto the WTO. And the Chinese said, yes, okay, we will do this because we want to come onto the WTO. And at the time, China was the was the largest economy in the world. So with the blessings of the US and ultimately with the help of the Bush administration, in December of 2001, China joined the WTO. Now, obviously, joining the World Trade Organization was not, I would say, the only reason the Chinese economy improved, but it was an important reason. And from that point, the Chinese economy grew exponentially. It grew exponentially from the sixth largest economy in the world to the second largest economy in the world. And it did it in a time frame that was faster than most of the analysts sort of believed that they would get to that point. They always knew that China had the potential to become the second largest and eventually the largest economy in the world, but they did it in a time frame that was genuinely shocking. And they used their position and their manufacturing ability to become the factory of the world, manufacturing pretty much everything under the sun and selling to countries at sort of dirt cheap rates. At this time, leadership transitioned from Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao, and Hu Jintao advocated, and his foreign policy was the peaceful rise of China, because as China started trading, as China's economy improved, as China sort of, lifted about 400 million people out of poverty, there were worrying signs of Chinese authoritarianism. And why that was the US expected that along with cash and money and capital flowing into China, ideas of liberalization would also flow. So on the one hand, you'd have money from the outside flowing in, and at the same time, you would have ideas of liberalization, of democratization flowing in. It was a natural consequence. But instead, China started cracking down. It became more authoritarian. They thought that this would be an opportunity to democratize China by bringing it into the global order, but the absolute opposite happened. China built its own internet. Basically, it created this great Chinese firewall that effectively censored out social media. It effectively censored out content that was deemed, offensive to the state. It censored out content that was critical of China. It censored out content that it believed would eventually be critical of China. And at the same time, it became more repressive in the way that it dealt with its people, from the social credit scores to becoming an Orwellian authoritarian state. So there was a lot of backsliding in terms of political liberalization. In fact, it became more authoritarian, more autocratic. And at the same time, China was developing its military exponentially. it is around this time that Hu Jintao advocated. He came out with this foreign policy that said, look, this is the peaceful rise of China. We don't have aspirations of being a global superpower. We believe we can coexist with the global superpowers. We believe we can live in a US-led world. We believe that we can trade and make money. We are not at competition with anybody. We are not sort of trying to usurp or dominate in the region. This is our peaceful rise, and our military expansion is our right as any growing nation to protect our trade, to protect our territorial integrity, and to protect ourselves from terrorism, right? So at this time, Hu Jintao was very sort of careful in his diplomatic approach to try and not antagonize the West, and not to try and antagonize the rest of the world, while growing his economy, and at the same time becoming all that more authoritarian. In 2013, power passed from Hu Jintao to Xi Jinping, the villain of our story, if I may call him. Now, Xi Jinping, now imagine you are the general secretary of the world's largest population, of a country which is the second largest economy in the world, of a military that is second only to the United States government. You've had that platform ready and handed over to you. You have everything in place for you to take China to the next level, right? And Xi Jinping fundamentally saw himself or sees himself as a founding father. He sees himself in the same league as Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong. He believes that in the song Apna Time Aayega, he believes Apna Time Aa Gaya Hai, right? So fundamentally, he said, look, we have the money, we have the economy, we have the military, no more Mr. Nice China. We are going to show the world that we have arrived. We are a force to reckon with, and it's now going to be our way or the highway. So the sort of diplomacy changed drastically, and that's fundamentally because Xi Jinping invested heavily in diplomacy. He increased the budget allocated to diplomats and said, look, if you're a diplomat that deals with Americans, please feel free to criticize any other country. Please feel free to be more vocal, be more aggressive in your criticisms. Please feel free to be more combative. Why should you be more combative and more offensive and more in your face? Is simply because the world needs China. They need our trade. They need our cell phones. They need our rare earths. They need our technologies. They need our Huawei. They need our labor. They cannot do without us. They will not be able to replicate the manufacturing. They will not be able to replicate their services at the same cost at which we are offering it to them. And in many cases, China was the world's largest trading partner for many countries. It still remains for many of the developed world, the world's largest trading partner. So he said, become more combative, become more assertive. And this really pained a lot of old world diplomats from the Jiang Zemin era, diplomats from the Hu Jintao era, who believed fundamentally in quiet diplomacy, instead of not antagonizing, instead of not stepping on toes. And mind you, these were the diplomats who were criticized by the Chinese population. They were being sent calcium tablets saying, you guys have no backbone. Why are you being so subservient? Why are you being so nice? Why are you being so timid? Why are you not really punching above your weight? And when they saw Xi Jinping telling his diplomats, look, I want you to go after everybody. I don't want you to step down. I want you to look somebody in the eye and push back. If somebody says something, bully them, intimidate them, right? And a lot of people, especially a lot of the younger Chinese, resonated with this sort of new breed of wolf warrior diplomacy. Now, what is wolf warrior diplomacy? Wolf warrior is actually a hit Chinese movie where a special operations unit of the People's Liberation Army, the Wolf Warrior Unit, puts down an evil African militia run by American mercenaries. And at the end of the movie, there is this whole, they show a Chinese passport saying, citizens of China, if you find yourself in trouble in a foreign country, do not worry, you are backed by a strong motherland. So that's where the breed wolf warrior diplomacy was coined, from this movie. And these wolf warrior diplomats believe that we don't need to be diplomatic in the way that we negotiate with the world. We are coming from a position of strength. We have the second largest army. We have, in many ways, the world's largest navy. We can go to war. We can assert ourselves geopolitically, so we don't have to be nice. We can push back as much as we want. And that led to this sort of new breed of wolf warrior diplomacy. At the same time, Xi's ambitious project was to connect the world. He believed that for Chinese, he wanted to make China the center. He wants to make China the center of the world. He wants to make to sort of realize the China's destiny of the Middle Kingdom. Because early on in China's history, China always saw itself as ruling all under heaven, where China is central to the world and all roads and all trade come in and out of China. So he wanted to fundamentally put China as the central sort of country in the world that would trade with the world and bring the world closer. And that led to his ambitious Belt and Road Initiative program, or the BRI program. What is the BRI program? Was the lending of Chinese money to develop infrastructure projects in countries that would link China to the rest of the world. So ports, bridges, highways, railways, canals, large-scale multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects that would sort of link China with the rest of the world, make trade easier between China and countries far away, facilitate greater trade, and provide economic development to all countries who are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, so far, about 68 countries are part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and there has been nothing more controversial than the Belt and Road Initiative, depending on who you ask. Like, there are some analysts who say that the Belt and Road Initiative is simply debt diplomacy. That is, China is exploiting poorer countries, poorer African countries. They are building them infrastructure that they don't really need. And when they know they can't repay the debt, they take over these ports, they take over these railways, they take over these what do you say, strategic locations, and use it to sort of as external military outposts or overseas military bases to keep an eye on their trade and their vital sort of geopolitical interests. An example being the Hambantota port, right? The Sri Lankan government wanted to build a port. They overestimated the demand. They did not have the money to pay back China, and China ended up taking it on a 99-year lease. Even Maldives. The Maldives owes the Chinese government 78% of their GDP, or $1.4 billion. So these are classic examples of debt diplomacy, right? The Chinese sort of nearly taking control of the Mombasa port in Kenya are classic examples of debt diplomacy. But there are those who say, no, it's not really debt diplomacy. A lot of these countries are fundamentally corrupt. They are fundamentally greedy, and they have a history of mismanaging funds. China has on many occasions waived loans. On many occasions, it has deferred loans simply because a lot of these countries aren't able to pay. So there's a huge debate on whether the Belt and Road Initiative is fundamentally a project that really wants to help developing nations and connecting them to China, or more of an insidious method of control where these countries could be exploited and eventually used for China's geopolitical, geostrategic ambitions. And the verdict is out. So depending on what you do your research, what your opinions, you could have one opinion or the other. One thing is for sure, that the net beneficiary of the Belt and Road Initiative has always been China, right? Because they have developed this infrastructure, and many times the countries have not been able to pay back, and they have ended up using this infrastructure, and they will continue to do so to advance their geopolitical goals and their geopolitical ambitions. The most telling aspect of what do you say, Chinese foreign policy is the way they have handled the pandemic, right? And you would think after unleashing coronavirus on the world, China would be a lot more conciliatory, a lot more humble in its approach. It's actually been quite the opposite. China, if anything, has been assertive. It has been aggressive. It has bullied and intimidated anyone who has dared to speak out against China about the coronavirus pandemic. It has bullied countries like Sweden. It has launched a trade war with Australia for calling for a WHO probe in the coronavirus by hiking tariffs on Australian wine and other Australian products. by about 200, 300%. It has antagonized, countries who have dared to question China on the coronavirus outbreak, asking for more information, asking for more transparency. So this is a country that even after releasing a pandemic onto the world has decided that, look, we are going to be aggressive. Yes, we have put a pandemic in yes, there is a pandemic. No, it's not our fault. It probably originated from America. It's probably originated from Italy. It's probably originated from India. You're victimizing us. We will not be victimized. And if you try to cross us, if you try to condemn us publicly, if you try to say in any forum that China is at fault, we will punish you diplomatically, we will punish you economically, we will hike our tariffs, we will prevent your goods from entering our country, and we will cause you a huge hit to your pocket. Because for many of these countries, China is the largest trading partner. So a lot of countries, so they have essentially during this pandemic bullied a lot of countries into silence. Very few countries have dared to speak up and say, no, you are responsible, not just for this pandemic, but for trying to cover it up. And now still not sharing information with the world on how this really happened, just not so that we can point fingers at you or accuse you, but just so that we can prevent the next pandemic whenever it occurs, so that we are forewarned and we are forearmed. What is also telling is that China has used this opportunity while countries are struggling with the pandemic to continue with its territorial claims, right? China claims virtually the entire South China Sea, right? It has disputes with Myanmar, with Brunei, with Vietnam, with the Philippines, with Malaysia. It has disputes over reefs with all the countries in the South China Sea. It has effectively claimed the South China Sea. It continues to claim the South China Sea. In fact, if you watch CNN today, you will find that 180 or 200 ships have actually, Chinese ships have actually geared out the Philippines, Juan Philippine Reef. So even in a time of the pandemic, with Philippines reeling under the coronavirus, China has used this opportunity to aggressively assert its territorial control in the South China Sea. It has continued to militarize the South China Sea. It has continued to occupy disputed reefs. It has continued to build artificial islands, militarize these islands with air bases and anti-aircraft weaponry. It has continued to its shipbuilding program to harass and intimidate the coast guard and fishing vessels of other countries that it has disputes with. And it is doing so at a much more accelerated pace, knowing that these countries are reeling with the coronavirus pandemic and knowing that they are helpless. Likewise, even with India, at the height of the pandemic, China occupied the heights of Ladakh. It occupied the Galwan Valley, the Gogra Hot Springs, the Pangong So Lake, the Daulat Bay Goldie, the Depsang Bulge, and tried to grab territory on a huge scale. They were surprised. The Chinese ultimately got a bloody nose and realized that this is a new India with a new resolve, that that this is not an India that's going to back down, and their salami slicing techniques that was employed by Hu Jintao, which was grab inches and inches and nibbles of land, nibble, is not going to work. Right? Because India has invested heavily in infrastructure along the border. It was this infrastructure development that really spooked the Chinese and pushed them into action. And they believed that because India was a country that was weak, inferior, and would probably collapse under the coronavirus, this would be an opportunity for them to grab a massive amount of territory in one go, pushing their claim lines from the current line of actual control back to the 1959 claim line. So this is a country that's foreign policy under Xi Jinping is assertive, it's aggressive, it's in your face. And it is very clear that this new China is not going to back down. It's not going to take criticism. It's not going to be intimidated. It's not going to be coerced. It is not going to be reasoned with. It is a country that says that if you want to do business with us, you have to be conciliatory, you have to be genuflective, you have to be deferential, you have to be subservient, and you have to be grateful and do it on our terms. And if you are not interested in doing it, we have ways to punish you. We have ways to hurt you. We have ways to, block to block your geopolitical ambitions, either bilaterally or through multilateral institutions. Now, also bear in mind that Xi Jinping is a man who fundamentally believes that it is his destiny to um, reunite China. Already, he has already used the coronavirus pandemic to pass a very controversial national security law in Hong Kong, and now subsequently a Patriots Law, ending democracy in Hong Kong, ending autonomy in Hong Kong, and now making Hong Kong a virtual city of China in all but name. Right? He has done this without firing a shot because he understands the optics of the Tiananmen Square massacre. He has understood that the coronavirus or pandemic was an opportunity for him to pass these draconian laws, because while the world was dealing with the pandemic and with its own populations dying and falling sick, he could assert his goals over Hong Kong. While the coronavirus pandemic is raging, he has asserted his claims more forcefully in the South China Sea. He has asserted his claims more forcefully in Ladakh. And he sees himself as someone who will eventually unify China. He sees himself as someone who will one day reoccupy Taiwan, and as someone who will reoccupy Arunachal Pradesh, southern Tibet. And he is hell-bent on the five-finger strategy of Tibet, which is the eventual sort of subjugation of Nepal or Bhutan or Sikkim. So he sees himself as someone who will complete China's destiny, who will sort of reunite China and make the country the de facto ruler of the world, and bring it and bring Chinese rule to all under heaven. And for him to have done that, he has worked very carefully and mercurially to consolidate power, because to understand his foreign policy, you must understand how he has operated diplomatically and domestically. When he first assumed power and he had this huge support, he realized that he needed to be able to make decisions on his own. He needed to be able to make decisions without interference from other power blocks or power structures within the party, like, for example, the Shanghai clique or the Jiang Zemin clique. So what he did was he began with this massive anti-corruption drive, purging a lot of officials in the country who were deemed corrupt. But this was widely seen as a front for him to purge a lot of his political rivals and those who posed him a threat. He purged Beau Gilai for, I believe, the murder of Neil Haywood, and that was a big rival. And once he got through these purges, he consolidated his power. He consolidated his power to a point where in 2019, at the Chinese at the 70-year anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, or the founding of modern China, he declared himself leader for life. So effectively, he abolished term limits, and effectively he said, I am going to be sitting on this throne till I die. So Xi Jinping has achieved autocratically only what Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping have achieved in their lifetimes, which is complete autocratic rule. So when you think of Chinese foreign policy in today's context, it is not the foreign policy of the Chinese Communist Party, or it is not a foreign policy that is thought of by analysts, by ministers, by political apparatchiks. It is the foreign policy of one man. So the question now, and this is the final part of the talk, and at which point I will sort of open it up to questions and answers, is how does India deal with this? See, in my opinion, in the first mistake that India made when it sort of normalized relations with China in the 80s is we decided to de-link the border issue with business, which is why since the 90s and the 2000s, they've been able to nibble away at borderland in Ladakh, in Arunachal Pradesh, nibble, while trading with us, because we said, look, we will try and demarcate the border with them, but at the same time, we shouldn't stop them from doing business with us. It is now, after this incursion in 2020, the government has finally woken up and said, look, we cannot distinguish the border from doing business. It is interlinked. As long as you keep grabbing land, we are not going to do business with you, which I think was an important step, which was very long overdue. So the first thing is to now, I would say, link territorial integrity with trade, territorial integrity with business. That's number one. That's my first recommendation. My second recommendation is to improve infrastructure in the border areas. See, up to recently, up to maybe 10 years ago, The fundamental military belief was that we will not develop we will not develop infrastructure in the border areas because it would make a Chinese advance harder. And if it makes a Chinese advance harder, we would be able to pick them off. Now, that was obviously an incorrect thinking. The thinking has now changed to say, look, we need to rapidly develop border infrastructure. And it is a lot of this rapidly developed border infrastructure that has actually rattled the Chinese. So that's something that's happening, and it's continuing to happen at an accelerated pace now that these border incursions have happened. Number three, how do you wean yourself off China? And I would say the answer to that is supply chain resilience, right? See, India may be the pharmacy of the world, but 68% of the ingredients, active ingredients that go into these pharmaceutical products, the raw materials come from China, right? The Chinese smartphones still dominate the Indian market. So how do you wean yourself away from China? The answer is not so much in being Atmanirbhar. No country can produce everything in the world, right? It's just not possible. You have to trade, whether raw materials or final products. What you need is supply chain resilience. What India needs to do is to start actually forming or signing free trade agreements with the European Union, with the US, that will allow India to become an alternate manufacturing hub for factories leaving China. Vietnam has succeeded in pulling away a lot of Chinese business because they have a free trade agreement with Europe. India does not. India does not have a deal with Europe. It does not have a deal with the US. It needs trade deals. It needs these trade deals to be able to lure American and European businesses away from China, because they are wary. American and European businesses are wary. They've been subject to massive intellectual property theft. They have been subject to cyber attacks. They have been subject to intrusions by members of the Chinese Communist Party. These have all been very well documented. So they are looking fundamentally to move away from China to countries where their IP will be protected, but labor costs and production costs remain low. So it's either countries like Vietnam or countries like India. And what India needs to do is to ensure supply chain resilience. We need to, and this is not going to happen overnight. This is going to take another 10, 15, 20 years. But we need to fundamentally become a more attractive option for luring companies away and factories away from China to India. And the answer to that is trade, 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 trade. We need to sort of lower our barriers and become more inclusive in our trading policies. But I will not go into it simply because it's a huge cul-de-sac, but it's something that India needs to do very constructively and very aggressively. Number four, and this is something that Colonel Hariharan will touch on tomorrow, is that we need to build a military that's sufficient. Not see, with our military budget, there can never be a reoccupation of Aksai. There is never going to be a reoccupation of Gilgit-Baltistan, not with our military, not with our military capacity. But what we need is a robust military and robust, command and control structures, and more civilian military coordination, more civilian military fusion, a national security strategy, a national security white paper, essentially to build a strong enough military that will deter Chinese aggression on the border. Because if they know we have a strong military, they will be forced to stop nibbling territory and then come to the negotiating table to demarcate the border. Because right now they have no interest in demarcating the border. They know that at any given time they can penetrate into the Indian side of the line of actual control, needle India, force it to deploy vast amounts of men and arms and material to the border to counter China at a huge loss. So anytime they want to needle us, all they need to do is to intrude. We need to show that we have such a powerful military that if they dare try to intrude, not only are we capable of holding our lands, we are capable of dealing an offensive punch and entering their territory and giving them a knock. So we need to create a military strong enough not to reoccupy the Aksai Chin or the Gilgit-Baltistan, but to be able to give them such a humiliating bloody nose that their only logic is for them to sit down with us and demarcate the border. Now, obviously, when they demarcate the border, there will be a give and take. It's diplomacy. We will lose some territory, they will lose some territory, but ultimately we will have a border. So develop a military to sort of bring them to the negotiating table, and that way demarcate the border. Number five, and this is my fifth recommendation, be wary of Chinese, investments in, and especially in the tech sector. Because we have found that in companies like Huawei and other tech majors, these companies are heavily subservient to the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army. In fact, there are laws in China that say that these companies have an obligation to share information with the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army. So when you think about using Huawei as part of your communications network, and especially in the backdrop of the Mumbai power grid being hacked by the Chinese, you want to be extraordinarily careful in who you go into bed with in terms of your technology reliance, in terms of your semiconductors, your microprocessors, in terms of who's supplying you these sensitive technologies, because you don't want your entire communications network reliant on China to a point where with one flip of the switch, it shuts down completely. So you need to move away and start looking at not just developing in-house technologies, but partnering with um, other tech providers to build a robust and resilient network communications infrastructure in India. Unless you develop a sort of semi-self-reliant infrastructure, it's never going to be 100% self-reliant. You are going to need help from the outside. That's just the way the world works. You are not going to be truly free of these Chinese shackles. So that in a nutshell is what I believe India needs to do to sort of counter China assertively. I understand that we're sort of running out of time. As I said, it's a huge area to cover. I'm going to stop now. I thank you for your time. I thank you for listening to me, and I will open the floor to questions, if any.
Thank you, sir, for your enlightened session. Am I audible to everyone?
Yes, you are.
Yes, sir. Okay, now we'll move to open forum for questions. But before that, I'd like to make some announcement that the participants is expected to submit their articles or issue briefs related to these topics to C3S. The insightful articles will be released from their websites, and those participants will be awarded with certificates, free membership to Young Minds of C3S, and also an opportunity to apply for internship at C3S. Now we are moving for question hour, and I would request the audience again to type their question in the chat box, and I will reach them to sir. Okay, sir. There are some questions from our audience.
Please
I'm
ask away.
I'm like to. Um, there is a question from Devisha. Do
Right.
you think the aggressive diplomacy that China has adopted is going to benefit it for long run?
No, I don't believe that this sort of diplomacy is beneficial at all. I believe that this sort of this sort of diplomacy will only continue to antagonize, China's partners. And look at what's already happening, right? Ever since, for example, take a classic case is China and Australia, right? Ever since China started this trade war with Australia, Australia has become a more vocal critic of China. It has become a more active member of the quadrilateral dialogue, and it has been a more vociferous in opposing China and looking for, more importantly, looking at new markets like India for its wine and its surplus goods. So what happens is if you're going to challenge a country that says, look, we're not going to buy from you, go to hell. What that country is going to do is it's going to be forced to look at new, more reliable partners to trade with. And once it finds these reliable partners to trade with, it's not going to go back to you. Simultaneously, what China is doing is it's also antagonizing Taiwan by flying aircraft into their air defense zone, by flying routine aircraft into the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, and antagonizing these countries. Now, obviously, understand that China and Taiwan, despite having an antagonistic relationship, still trade with each other. A lot of Chinese factories are based in Taiwan and vice versa. So you're essentially antagonizing business. Same with Japan. In fact, as a result of these Chinese antagonizing the Japanese in the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, the Japanese have actually announced a $1 trillion program to relocate Japanese countries from China back to Japan or in any other third country. They're saying, look, leave China. We will pay the cost for you to leave China and settle anywhere else. So in the long run, these policies will be detrimental to China because it will force countries to realize that, look, and another example is the EU-China trade deal, right? The European Union and the Chinese government have worked very hard on this trade deal. But at the same time, because of the detention camps, because of the Uyghurs being locked up and raped and tortured and sterilized and beaten and incarcerated, the European Union sanctioned 4 members of the Chinese Communist Party in Xinjiang. Just not Chinese parliamentarians, but 4 members of the party in Xinjiang. What did the Chinese do? They retaliated by sanctioning European parliamentarians of the European Union. And that has now put this entire EU-China trade deal dead in the water. This would have been a trade deal that would have boosted China's economy and given entry to Chinese Chinese products to the European market. Because they have not taken a calibrated approach, because they have gone sanctioning European parliamentarians, this deal is now dead in the water. So obviously this is a diplomacy that's not going to pay off in the long run, but they now believe we are wolf warriors. We're going to take on the world. Apna time aaya hai. Right? Nobody is going to talk to us. The West are hypocrites. They have massacred their Native Americans. They have massacred their African Americans. They're racists. They treat their minorities like second-class citizens. So why are they lecturing us? That is where they come from. If you, for example, if you try and criticize China, they will say, oh, you have your George Floyds, so don't talk to us about our Xinjiangs. So, but ultimately in the long run, it's going to be detrimental. And this is something that they will see over a period of time.
Okay. So there is another question. It is from Siddhesh. The question is, what is China's foresight in creating newer ties with Iran? Is it only because of CPEC is threatened, or do they have plans in the MENA region?
Okay, thank you. That's a good question. See, the Middle East is basically a mess, right, for the lack of a better word. And what's very clear is Iran is seen as an existential threat. Two, Iran being a majority Shia country is seen as an existential threat to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE, to the other Gulf countries who are majority Sunni. To a point that recently, a lot of these countries, which is the UAE and Qatar and Bahrain and Oman, have actually normalized relations with Israel at the cost of the Palestinians, simply because of their existential fear of Iran, right? So obviously, this Iran is, as a country, is geostrategically located on the Strait of Hormuz trade routes, and this is a huge game changer in the region, because what would happen is China, by developing infrastructure projects, by developing port projects in Iran, will be able to play a more decisive role in trade that's coming through the Straits of Hormuz. And the Straits of Hormuz is an integral trade route. So, and it's obviously going to play a huge role in the security architecture of the region, because Iran is routinely, what do you say, funding and what do you say, insurgencies in Yemen by supplying the Houthis. It's what do you say, backing non-state actors in Syria, non-state actors in Afghanistan, in Iraq. So it's waging its low-wage, what do you say, conflicts, low-level intensity conflicts by funding Shia groups or Shia sort of affiliated groups, whether it's even Hezbollah in Lebanon. So obviously, with Iran being such a powerful regional player, using the Iranian Revolutionary the IRGC to sort of, fund these low-level intensity conflicts, and with China coming in as a sort of security guarantor in the region, it just brings a completely new dimension to the dynamics of the Middle East. And I think what's going to happen is it's going to push the Gulf countries and Israel deeper into collaboration with America, and more importantly, deeper into collaboration with India. So there's a lot of opportunity here, I would say, for India to play a more decisive role in the Middle East.
Okay, sir. There is a question from Shreya.
Yes.
Why did us want to democratize China? Had us started fearing China? Can the extraordinary Chinese growth be credited to communism?
No, I wouldn't say communism. See, communism has failed. There is no country in the world where communism as a model has succeeded. I know we as students, we joke about communism, we rail against the capitalist inequality, and we have nice memes on the internet. And that's fun, but you have to understand that communism has been bloody and violent. You look at the Cambodia's Khmer Rouge, right? 4 million deaths. You look at the Soviet Union, about 20-30 million purged under Stalin and subsequent leaders, Khrushchev and Brezhnev. You look, Mao Zedong's agrarian communism has failed. Vietnam's model of communism failed. It's not communism. It's fundamentally a one-party sort of. China is the world's largest capitalist. They are not communists. They are simply a one-party state. They don't have democratic opposition. Here in a country like India, if you want to build a bridge across a river, you will have environmental groups taking you to court. You will have the opposition taking you to court. You will have a whole bunch of vested interests taking you to court. With the Chinese government, they just need to look outside the river, outside the window, and say that river needs a bridge in the next 20 minutes. And there's nobody really there to approve, to sort of, fight them. And the whole, and democracy is ultimately messy, right? The goals and the policies and objectives of one government may be completely ripped up by another government who may want to take the country in a different direction. So there's not a lot of consistency between different governments from different political parties, but that's not the case. China, being a one party system, does not have any form of political opposition, even at the grassroots level. So it's, and more importantly, China has decentralized, right? It's decentralized to the various districts, and it's told the district governors and the district heads, you are all competing with each other. You are all going to compete with each other, and we are going to incentivize you based on how much manufacturing you bring, based on how much industry you bring, and based on how much you improve the quality of life and pull people out of your region in poverty. And if you are able to do all of these things, you move higher up in the party and you move closer to the top. So when you know that this is your only way to the top, you will work your butt off to try and develop your region to the best possible region and give it the best possible indicators. So it's not really because it's a communist country, it's a one party country, it's a one party system that has learned how to decentralize and incentivize its regional governments.
Okay, sir. Thank you. There is another question. How is People's Republic of China's views and policy on Taiwan is changing nowadays and could lead to what direction on Taiwan policy?
See, the policy towards Taiwan has always been the same. The People's Republic of China do not recognize Taiwan as an independent country. And if Taiwan were to, while Taiwan is an independent country, it has its own government, it has its own elections, it's a democratic country, it cannot say that it is independent, because if it says that it's independent, then the Chinese have said that it will go to war and next Taiwan. And the only reason the Chinese have not done so is because the US is a net security provider. What China is going to try and do is to continue to isolate Taiwan diplomatically. There are about 15 countries in the world that continue to recognize Taiwan over China. And I don't know if you read, there was an article that said that there were people connected to the Chinese Communist Party that went to the government of Paraguay. Now, the government of Paraguay recognizes Taiwan, does not recognize the People's Republic of China. So it was PRC. So there were those affiliates of the PRC who went to the government of Paraguay and said, look, we will give you vaccines, but dump your recognition of Taiwan, right? So what they're going to seek to do is to continue to diplomatically isolate Taiwan, and Xi Jinping is very active in trying to diplomatically isolate Taiwan by going to these countries that recognize Taiwan and saying, look, I will give you the mother of all trade deals, I will give you the mother of all investments, I will make you a wealthy, developed nation, but for that, you need to sort of, diplomatically de-recognize Taiwan and recognize us as the legitimate China. I don't foresee a war for annexation. I believe a war will be expensive. I believe a war could fail, and I believe a war will damage China's global image irreparably. All trust in China would completely evaporate, and you'd see the world taking a more militaristic approach. So I do not see a conflict to actually annex Taiwan. I think it would be the act of a madman. But I would see Xi Jinping continuing to diplomatically isolate Taiwan, make it difficult for Taiwan to deal with the rest of the world, and make it increasingly dependent on China for its economy.
Okay, sir. We are going to have a last question and then we will close the session.
Sure.
The question is, how could the poorer countries save themselves from the so-called Chinese debt trap? You told that about that.
How do the poorer countries? I think that the poorer countries need to see again. It all depends, right? There's no single answer, right? Again, a lot of these countries have not only Chinese debt to pay back, but they also have IMF debt. They have World Bank debt. So it's not going to be easy. I think what they need is to calibrate their responses and calibrate how they deal with China. They need to be able to work with China to be able to ensure that their national security and their sovereignty and their political decision making is not infringed, right? Look what's happening in Zimbabwe. China is actually testing artificial intelligence facial recognition software in Zimbabwe before its eventual use in China itself, right? Look at what's happening in Gambia. China has developed fisheries to make powdered fish that's caused vast ecological damage. What do you say? The Chinese have actually built air bases, a sort of military bases in Africa to oversee their trade coming out of the Horn of Somalia. So when you look at these countries, I think fundamentally what they need to do is to be able to make sure that while the Chinese have access to this infrastructure and while they're using this infrastructure, that it does not infringe on their ability to make independent national security and political decisions. And at the same time, they need to ensure that China does not use this infrastructure to militarize its capability overseas. They need to ensure that this infrastructure that they are now sitting on is used purely for civilian purposes, with maybe some anti-piracy efforts or some overlay of trade route protection. So it's going to be a very difficult road ahead for these countries, but they need to be very careful. And for that, they need allies. They need backers like India. They need backers like the US to sort of back them financially as they start to wean away from China. They need greater acceptance from the IMF and the World Bank. They need these institutions to extend them lines of credit to be able to waive off existing debts so that they can use the money to wean themselves off China. So they will require a multi-stakeholder approach and consensus. And countries must be willing to invest in these countries to help them wean off. So it'll have to be a very carefully calibrated approach.
Okay, thank you, sir. For the lack of time, I apologize to the audience that I could not address all of their questions. There will be more sessions. You can take the questions there, and you can also write up your views in the articles. So there are all the details regarding the submission of articles is in the chat box. Please go over them. And thank you, sir, again for this enlightening session.
Thank you,
Thank you on behalf of whole IIT Kanpur. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Have a good day. Cheers. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye. Stay safe.